Good morning, and thank you so much for coming a little bit early. And I'm going to give you a summary of my talk so that if you want to go back to bed, you won't miss too much of anything. So all of us have our own definition of transpersonal psychology, and here is mine. We have to start out with the definition of psychology. Psychology is disciplined inquiry into behavior and experience. Transpersonal psychology is disciplined inquiry into behavior and experience that appears to expand individuals' socially constructed identity into areas deeper, broader, higher, or wider. So, implicit in those shifts is transformation. And I'm going to be talking about transpersonal transformative experiences today. And I will make the point that the spiritual transformation experiences are an example of the higher and the lower. Higher in terms of the Wilber hierarchy, for example. Lower in terms of the Jungian descent into the psyche and into the archetypal realm. But there's also secular transformative experiences. Now this is where the broader and wider come into the picture. Wider in terms of encompassing non-Western psychologies, as David Lukoff so brilliantly told you, and having an identity with Eastern or indigenous psychologies, but also broader in terms of encompassing commonalities with nature, with humanity as a whole. So, transpersonal psychology covers both of these transformational experiences. Now, if you shift your attention to the screen, we're going to start out with a project that a student of mine did at Saybrook University, where she identified spiritual content of dreams. The Hall-Vandecassel content analysis of dreams method has 50 different major categories, but it leaves out spirituality. So she developed a content system identifying spiritual objects, spiritual characters, spiritual settings, spiritual activities, spiritual emotions, and spiritual experiences, in which the dreamers reported a connection with something of significance felt to be beyond their understanding and or individual existence that is associated with a sense of reverence, sacred, and awe. This is my definition of the spiritual. And as you can see, the spiritual is not a synonym for transpersonal. Many people make that mistake. No. Spiritual is one component of transpersonal, but transpersonal is much more global. So, here's an example of scoring on that dream scale. My friends and I walked near the technical school, and then we went on a road somewhere and found ourselves by the cemetery. It was late and dark. When I turned my face to the cemetery, spirits began to rise from their graves. They moved toward us. We were afraid, so we kneeled and worshipped. Then a bright beam appeared around us. Okay, this was a Ukrainian female dream report, and it was scored for spiritual characters, settings, activities, emotions, and experiences. Here's another one from Brazil. In this dream, a spirit is calling me to live a life of service. The spirit tells me I need to work at the temple to learn how to help my neighbors. At first, I'm frightened of the spirit and her message, but then I feel very good inside. The spirit's message inspires me. So this is scored for characters, settings, activities, emotions, and experiences. And when we looked at our whole collection of dreams collected in my dream workshops throughout the years, we found a great deal of variance. Argentina, 5% females, 4% males, spiritual content in dreams. Brazil, 30% and 45%. Everything else, some part in the middle. Well, this is a somewhat simplistic way of identifying spiritual content, but you have to start somewhere. And there are certain experiences like dreams where you can never do justice to the full dream. You're always dealing with a dream report, you're always dealing with a partial understanding, and this has to make us modest when we do this type of work. Now here's an application. Dr. Tarras, co-author of the original report, once worked with a client in his late 20s. The client reported a dream in which everything was bright and new. Suddenly he changed into an old man and life's freshness seemed to have faded. Now the only certainty that the future held was death. The dreamer experienced fear and thought that if he meditated enough he would become eternal. He began to meditate and the myth of Gilgamesh came to mind. This is all in the dream, by the way. He then realized that his attempt was futile because, like Gilgamesh, he would eventually die. But like Gilgamesh, he resolved to make himself useful to society and to live in the present moment. Then he woke up. The dream played a significant role in creating therapeutic changes. The dream's main theme was the realization of death accompanied by fear. Another theme was the dreamer's attempt to prevent his demise through spiritual practices, an attempt that proved futile. Finally, the dream encouraged the dreamer to take an active role in his life by contrast to his usual passivity. The client followed up this insight by becoming a more active member of society, participating in organizations committed to positive social change. Now, our work with the scale coincided with Yvonne Caisson's introduction of the term spiritually transformative experiences to describe experiences of reverence, awe, or contact with the sacred that transform the life of a person or a group. And as I said earlier, transformation is very central to what we do in transpersonal psychology and what we study in transpersonal psychology. Her 1996 Further Shores describes her interviews with dozens of people whose STEs led to physical healing, cessation of addicted behavior, alleviation of suicidal depression, enhanced compassion, initiation of meditation or contemplative practices, and or involvement in social activism. Caisson's term inspired me to create a similar term, transpersonal transformative experiences, which is somewhat broader in nature than STEs because it includes participatory experiences, group transformation, and emancipatory relationships. STEs are one category of TTEs, the other category being secular transformative experiences. In other words, those that do not include an obvious spiritual component. And of course, it's difficult to make the division. There is overlap, there is fuzzy lines, but again, that's what happens when you deal with real lived experience. You draw lines and you always realize those lines that you draw are very artificial, but it's better than nothing. So, most of you already know this, but I'll give it a brief review. The word transpersonal was first introduced in Human Discourse by William James in the 1905 lecture. In 1942, Carl Jung used the term überpersönlich, which his English language translators rendered as transpersonal. In 1949, the term was used by the American psychologist Gardner Murphy, and in 1967, in various contexts, by Abraham Maslow, Anthony Sunich, and Stanislaus Grof. For me, the word transpersonal refers to experiences in which one's sense of identity seems to extend its customary limits, its socially constructed limits, to encompass higher, deeper, broader, and wider aspects of life. And transpersonal psychology is one of several transpersonal studies and investigates behaviors and cognitive affective experiences in which one's sense of identity is transformed. Transpersonal psychology focuses on the scientific understanding of the related stages of development and the shifts in consciousness that accompany this transformation, as well as the relevant paths of personal practice and its applications in counseling, psychotherapy, and education. And one area of study is that of transpersonal transformative experiences. A transformation of identity takes place without reference to a higher power, deity, or deeper aspects of the. If a transformation takes place without that, I would consider it to be a secular transformative experience. A secular transformative experience can lead to a shift of identity that incorporates a broader or wider aspect of consensual reality. Both spiritual transformative experiences and secular transformative experiences involve the shift of identity, thus are transpersonal in nature. It's important to differentiate these two types of TTEs because most suicide bombings are sponsored by religious and not secular terrorist groups. On the other hand, most efforts to cope with ecological crises, such as global warming, are fueled by secular rather than spiritual awakenings. These are the two great crises of today, terrorism and the ecological disasters, and I think transpersonal psychology has something to contribute to understanding and maybe helping to resolve both of these crises. Now I see that some of you are busy taking notes. Just write to me and I'll send you the whole PowerPoint and you'll have it in front of you and you don't have to waste your time taking notes. Harris Friedman and Bill Hartilius in the Wiley Blackwell Handbook of Transpersonal Psychology, which I cannot praise too highly, observed that transpersonal psychology has pioneered many marginalized areas of psychology that are now part of the mainstream. These include the phenomenology of consciousness, the spiritual content of Eastern thought and indigenous traditions, and the legitimization of qualitative research methods in the study of human behavior and experience. My definitions are an attempt to continue the disciplined inquiry articulated by Friedman, Hartilius, and many, many other researchers and practitioners of this dynamic field of study, many of whom are in this room today, of course. Well, here's a well-known example. There were many TTEs in the life of the Buddha, born about 566 BCE. On his first 3 trips outside the palace, he saw sickness, old age, and death, asking himself, how can I enjoy a life of pleasure when there's so much suffering in the world? On his 4th trip, he met a wandering monk who had given up everything and resolved to be like him. For 6 years, he practiced extreme asceticism, but no TTE resulted. He then started to eat nourishing food, regained his strength, resolved to sit under a holy tree until he found an answer to his question. Following temptations and conflicts, he attained enlightenment, understanding the cause of suffering and how to resolve it. For the next 45 years, he taught the 3 universal truths, the 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Path, the 5 precepts. His TTE continues to transform the world and its inhabitants. Now, as those of you who are familiar with the Buddha, there were a number of seminal experiences, and there's often not just one TTE, and often it's not something that happens immediately. Sometimes it's gradual. Sometimes it involves a group. Sometimes it's serial in nature. There are many TTEs in the Old and New Testaments in the Bible. Jacob beheld a ladder set upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. Joseph dreamed a dream about God, and he told his brothers, and they hated him even more. And then, in the New Testament, the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, fear not, take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And then, in the letters that come after that, the chapters that come after that, St. Peter refused to eat unclean food. But in a dream, God told him, do not call food unclean that God has cleansed. And this dream virtually ended pre-Christian food taboos. Some TTEs changed Christian history. Most notably, the vision of St. Paul of Jesus on the road to Damascus ended his persecution of Christians and turned him into a Christian activist. This vision initiated the spread of Christianity around the Mediterranean world. Those of you who are biblical scholars know that there is some controversy over whether or not Jesus existed as a historical personage. Well, there is no doubt that St. Paul existed as a historical personage, although all of the chapters attributed to him in the Bible were probably not written by him. Most of them were, but not all of them. You get into the era of biblical scholarship, which is fascinating. It breaks down some of your stereotypes. In 314 CE, Emperor Constantine reported having a vision of a cross superposed on a sun bearing a message in this sign compact. It was in Latin, of course, not in English. He won the battle, but he waited until 337 CE to formally convert to Christianity on his deathbed. However, the cross became the icon of Christianity, even though its importance is not cited in the Bible. The fact that the Emperor Constantine waited so long to convert makes some people wonder if the vision of the cross was not something he fantasized and imagined and used as a ploy to raise the morale of his troops. Well, of course, we'll never know, but it certainly served the purpose, and that Christianized that part of the ancient world. Some TTs trigger a new religion. Now, one thing that annoys me, you read accounts of Muhammad's night journey and many people say this is a dream. No, according to Islam, it was not a dream. In the New Testament, in the Old Testament, things happen in a dream, and those are properly attributed to dreams. You can't carry that over into another religion. So I just prefer to take it as it's stated in the Quran and call them night journeys. They were TTEs that had a world-changing impact. Around the year 621 CE, Muhammad was resting in Mecca when the Archangel Gabriel brought him a winged steed that carried him to the furthest mosque in Jerusalem, where he led the other prophets of Abrahamic descent in prayer. From there, he toured the circles of heaven, speaking to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and then was taken by Gabriel to Allah. This journey is described in the 17th chapter of the Quran. The words of Allah were dictated to Muhammad by Gabriel between 610 and 632 CE. Muhammad was illiterate, and he would recite the verses that his followers copied down and collated them. Muslims hold that Muhammad was so highly evolved that there was no dividing line between his conscious and unconscious. His night journeys are seen as actual visitations to heaven, which the Quran was dictated, and in turn Muhammad recited the text describes. But now here is a dream. Abdullah bin Ziyad was eager to introduce a recognizable call to prayer to the faithful. Just as the Jews were called to the synagogue with a ram's horn, and the early Christians to church by the sound of a rattle, during prayers, bin Ziyad fell asleep and dreamed of a man dressed in green who was carrying a rattle. Bin Ziyad asked if he could buy the rattle to use as a call for prayer. The man in green replied, "Call out, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet." Upon awakening, bin Ziyad told Muhammad of his dream, and the prophet instructed him to teach the exact phrase that he had heard to another follower who became the first muezzin. Some TTs have political implications, and I will need a glass of water, and I don't see one over here. Maybe somebody can.
No, it's on the podium.
Okay. Yeah. Right here, right in front of me. Thank you. They're way ahead of me. Thank you. The jet lag and the senior moment. The girl who was known as Joan of Arc began hearing voices at the age of 13. The year was 1425. English and Burgundian forces had burned down the town of Domremy, possibly focusing Joan's mind on the war. The voices were accompanied by white light, and Joan later identified them as St. Margaret, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. The latter two saints died as martyrs, just as Joan would die in 1431, but not until she motivated the French ruler to end England's occupation of France. So TTEs not only can influence religious movements, but political movements as well. And some TTEs are properly called spiritual awakenings. This is an unknown story to many people, but it's a fascinating one. Susan Champion de Crespigny was a member of a distinguished military family and married into nobility. She became a key organizer of spiritualistic organizations in Great Britain during the 1920s and 30s. Before that, she was an acclaimed novelist, poet, and advocate for women's right to vote. In 1922, she wrote The Mind of a Woman, in which she presented the lives of great women throughout history. Her orthodox use of Christianity and her conservative family background kept her from investigating mediumship and spiritualism. But once she attended a theosophical meeting and began reading related literature, it evoked a long-term TTE, a spiritual awakening that quickly led to leadership roles in several spiritualistic groups. And this is all told in her magnificent autobiography, The World, This World and Beyond. Here's a family TTE. A major instrument of modern neuroscience, the electroencephalogram, the EEG, was invented by the German scientist Hans Berger in 1924 in an attempt to detect and measure weak electromagnetic emanations of the human brain that he believed might be the carriers of telepathic communication. As a 19-year-old student, Berger fell with his horse down a steep ravine into the path of a mounted battery of guns pulled by 6 horses. Berger barely escaped with his life. That evening, Berger received a telegram from his father inquiring as to his well-being, the only time his father had ever made such an inquiry. The telegram was prompted by Berger's sister, who told her parents that Berger had suffered a serious accident based on a strong intuitive feeling and vision. In this case, it was Berger's sister who had a TTE that transformed history. And this could be classified as a secular transformative experience because no spiritual references were cited. Now, Berger became world famous, of course, but then Hitler came to power and tried to enlist Berger into inventing war machines. Well, Berger refused to do this, and his only recourse was suicide. So he is really a martyr to the cause of science and to his own principles. Most people don't know that chapter of the history, but it's a sad one and ending to a very important life. Pandit Gopi Krishna's traumatic TTE. In 1935, at the age of 34, during his morning meditation, Gopi Krishna experienced a stream of liquid light entering my brain through the spinal cord with a roar like that of a waterfall. This experience left him in a state of exaltation and happiness impossible to describe. However, this experience left him with insomnia, depression, and thoughts of suicide that took him a decade to resolve. Eventually, he established a small institute in Kashmir, which he used as a base of operations for his writings and lectures that took him all over the world. I had the great pleasure of visiting his institute twice while he was alive, and one thing that came out of those conversations was his conviction that genius and enlightenment were due to Kundalini awakening, and that this transformation usually occurs so gradually that people who have this type of TTE are often unaware of their inner development. So TTEs do not always happen as a flash of light or a vision or a dream. Sometimes they happen very, very gradually over the course of a person's development. And Gopi Krishna is the one who brought that to my mind, and I think that's been substantiated over the years. Here's an ecological TTE. Born in Berlin in 1933, George Shaler and his family emigrated to the United States in 1947, where he attended college at the University of Alaska. On a break between semesters, he joined Olaus Murie, America's most prominent field biologist, for a field trip to northern Alaska's Shinjek River Valley. It was there that Shaler had his TTE, what he later called his moment of enlightenment, but it lasted more than a moment. He and Murie's group cataloged dozens of species of wildlife, and he decided the whole point of biology of conservation, you have a moral obligation to protect what you study. He positively influenced the fate of a greater number of species than anyone else, including Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall, both of whom were inspired by him. He wrote several books and won numerous awards, including the World Wildlife Fund's Gold Medal. Then there are community TTEs. Sometimes a small group of people can have a TTE that triggers historical events. In pre-communist Russia, there was an ancient pagan tradition in which Mother Earth was given love and respect. In addition, there were groups of wizards who used herbs and earth energies for healing. And much later, Russian Orthodox Hesychasm practice emphasized inner silence. In 1917, the government espoused dialectical materialism, atheism. Such spiritually oriented groups ranging from Siberian shamans to the old believers were persecuted, while others went underground. I have many stories about the shamans in Siberia who I visited. They buried their drums, the ones that were killed by the communists, and then their grandchildren eventually dug up the drums once they were no longer persecuted, and the drums are now back in service. Fascinating story, what happened to the Siberian shamans. Well, one of these groups was founded by Porfiry Ivanov with a TTE and developed breathing exercises, cold water bathing, and exercises in attaining what he called Christ consciousness. The school of Porfiry Ivanov continues today, especially in Siberia. With the demise of the Soviet Union, this school and others now operate openly, but earlier they had kept Russia's spiritual traditions alive underground. Sometimes a spiritual emergency can call a TTE, and again I'm paying homage to my dear friend Christina Groff, who along with Stan Groff coined the term spiritual emergency, spiritual emergence, and she's irreplaceable. I miss her very badly. We all do. Dirk Tolle, born in Germany, spent his teenage years with his father in Spain, then went to London to study philosophy. At the age of 29, deeply depressed, he recalled, if I cannot live myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe only one of them is real. After this epiphany, he changed his first name in Eckhart in honor of a 13th century Dominican priest who died while being tried for heresy. Tolle went on to write best-selling books as The Power of Now and the New Earth. Some religious conservatives today have criticized him for making such statements as, was Jesus the Son of God? Yes, but so are you. You just haven't realized it yet. Well, back in the 13th century, he also would have been burned at the stake for making such statements. TTs are not always benevolent. And again, we have to consider that there are shadow sides to these types of experiences. A little more about that later. TTEs do not always lead to benevolent outcomes. When Sister Teresa, later Mother Teresa, the Nobel laureate, was traveling to Darjeeling in 1946, she heard God tell her that her life's work was to recognize the divinity in the poorest of the poor and to serve them with love. Exactly 50 years later, an Israeli student also heard God give him an order to kill Yitzhak Rabin, another Nobel laureate. There are devout persons who reject the divine origins of one or another of these commands, and there are skeptics who would belittle them both. Nevertheless, both incidents can be categorized as TTEs that changed history for better or for worse. The murder of Yitzhak Rabin, of course, was the last best chance that Israel and Palestine had of making peace, and if he would have lived, there would be a Palestinian state today. He didn't, because some students had a transformative experience and heard God. The same God of Mother Teresa? Of course not. But this is a paradox, that sometimes a TTE can lead to something that's life-denying instead of life-affirming. Now here's a secular transformative experience. When Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren was 12, she had a secular transformative experience. Elizabeth watched her mother's tear-drenched face as the woman struggled to put on her one decent dress. It was so tight that it was a chore to get it over her stomach and pull it down over her hips. She had to tug and pull to close the zipper, and then asked her daughter, "How do I look?" Elizabeth replied, "You look great," even though it seemed like the dress was ready to burst. Her mother was about to leave for an interview at Sears and Roebuck's mail-order office, answering phones and taking orders. Elizabeth's father was incapacitated by a heart attack, and it was up to her mother to get a job and save the family home. The family car had already been repossessed. Elizabeth recalled, "That is the day I crossed the threshold. I wasn't a girl anymore." But the transformation did not stop there. Elizabeth knew her mother's minimum wage job would just barely make ends meet. She decided to dedicate her life to taking the pressure off families who were treated with contempt by employers, by bankers, by corporations. Over the years, she recalled seeing countless numbers of working families go over the economic cliff, and running for executive office gave her the power to do something on their behalf. Frankly, I hope she runs for the presidency someday. She's one of my heroes. Now, in 2014, a student, Randy Rex Jarazaga, conducted interviews with 17 people who claimed to have transpersonal transformative experiences. Some were conducted in person and some on the internet. Of these 17 cases appear to have been spiritually transformative experiences, and 11 appear to have been secular transformative experiences. Some transformations appear to have happened immediately, while others took place over a longer time period. Well, here is Randy's description of what he did in the study, and here's a summary of what he found. These are male, female, and the experience summarized into one sentence, although sometimes they went on for pages. What compelled me to change? It was the love for my mom. My life changed after I dreamed that half of a heart was mine and half was Jesus. My boyfriend proved he was really in love with me and it turned my life around. I dreamed that my dead family was in a better place. This is very, very tragic. One of the typhoons in the Philippines had killed everybody in this woman's family, and she was in mourning, she was denying God, she was depressed, and then she had a dream in which her whole family appeared to her from heaven, saying they were fine, they were in a better place. This turned her life around, and she's now an active member of her community again. My girlfriend told me that we were meant to be together, and it changed my life. During those dark days, I found solace in the hands of my dad. I told God, I want you to come into my life and save me. Getting an abortion to end an unwanted pregnancy was the best thing I ever did. The love of my family helped me to get through the challenge. I went to church 3 times a week, and it was life-changing. I went to church, confessed my sins, and promised to do no more abortions. So here we have a case where getting an abortion was the best thing that ever happened to her, and another case, an illicit abortionist gave up abortions, and that was the best thing that ever happened to her. So these are some of the interesting and provocative ethical questions that these transformative experiences have. We'll have another one in just a few minutes. I realize there's too much good in the world to live as half a person. Getting caught by the police was the best thing that ever happened to me. The robbery incident and my arrest were the instruments of my turning point. I got caught by the soldiers. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. This is somebody who was a Muslim rebel. He was captured by the soldiers. He went through re-education. He changed. He gave up his militancy. He became a practicing Christian and gave up the militancy life for good. On the night of my grandfather's funeral, I resolved that I wanted to live as fully as he did. Now listen to this one. When the Filipino soldiers murdered my parents, I decided to join the Muslim rebels. So here we have a transformative experience of somebody who is joining the rebels instead of leaving the rebels, and they both are doing so because of a transformative experience. So as I say, we're going to get complicated waters here. These TTEs are cultural dependent. They're dependent on circumstances, and the ethical issues, I think, pose an issue for transpersonal psychology. They have been addressed by many people, but they need to be continually addressed. Well, some TTEs were spiritual, but had no context within an organized religion. Some TTEs were both spiritual and religious. If a TTE was neither spiritual nor religious, it was considered a secular transformative experience. Some TTEs contained both spiritual and secular aspects, but were classified in terms of predominant aspect of the experience. Okay, oh, here we go. On November 6, 2013, Typhoon Haiyan hit our country. One day before it happened, one of my children was celebrating his 7th birthday, and we invited relatives and friends. I never thought it'd be the last time I would see them. The next day it started to rain hard, and there was a strong wind. At noontime, huge waves came from the ocean battering us. All I could see was darkness. There was frantic screaming and I passed out. The next morning I found myself on the highway. I could barely walk and I was surrounded by hundreds of lifeless bodies. 2 more days passed, I realized I was the only one in the family who'd survived. My husband, my 3 daughters, and 4 sons were killed by the typhoon. I began to question, if there is really a God, where was he during the typhoon? I've never killed anyone, nor is anyone in the family. We're devoted Christians, so why us? I was going insane. I thought of killing people so they would realize how painful it is to lose your whole family. I locked myself in the house. I stopped going to church. Reading comics was my only escape. I planned to commit suicide the next day on the bridge. That night I had a fever and there was no medicine. I was chilled to the bone and fell asleep. I dreamed that I was in a place where there was a well, and not far from it was an oak tree. Under the tree I saw 8 people. When I went nearer, I realized it was my family. They were all smiling and wearing white clothes. I hugged them very tight. My husband said, "Ma, please take care of yourself. We're now in a safe and better place. It's painful how we've left you too soon, but we'll see each other again. We just left a little earlier. It wasn't yet your time during the typhoon." I woke up and found myself crying. I decided to become a domestic helper. I still do not know the logic of life. I think that's a very profound statement. She's not making up something simplistic. It was God's will, it was in the cards, it was fate, it was karma. No, she admits she does not know the logic of life. But what my husband told me that night in my dream has sustained me. I started going back to church again and renewed my Christian faith. Now, we can score all of these for spiritual content. Objects, the oak tree, the characters, the family members, settings, a safe and better place. Activities, they were all traveling, they were all smiling and wearing white clothes. Emotions, crying, and experiences, I hugged them, etc. So the scale we talked about half an hour ago can be applied to these transpersonal, transformative experiences. Here is Edgar's story. I'm 38 years of age, and this is my story. Ever since I knew the difference between right and wrong, my life was one big struggle. The world around me was confusing, and I felt very much alone. The pain was so bad I could not get close to another person. I started to take illegal drugs and watch pornography. Little by little, I went to my own private hell. I tried religion, but it didn't work for me. No matter what I tried, nothing made me feel better. I kept making bad decisions, and I was in terrible pain. I cried out to myself, why is there a hole in me that can't be filled? No matter what I put in there, I have a feeling of emptiness. Then it struck me that I was that empty hole. That very night I had a dream of a small circle being completed. Then the circle became a heart and it started beating. I woke up and I realized that half of the heart was mine and the other half belonged to Jesus. I just couldn't believe it. The next day I threw out all my drugs and booze and porn. I apologized to all the people that I'd insulted or hurt. The demons that controlled my mind were gone. Today I'm going to celebrate my birthday with family members, relatives, friends, and neighbors, and I know that wherever I go, Jesus is always there with me. So, this TTE can be scored for spiritual object, the heart, characters, Jesus, activities, the circle became a heart and started beating, emotions, emptiness, and experiences, half the heart was mine and the other heart belonged to Jesus. So you see how we've come full circle. We've taken the scoring system for spiritual content and dreams and applied it with TTEs. Here's Louisa's story. For 15 years, I held the position of commanding general of one of the militant groups in the Philippines. I murdered those who got in our way, including members of the Filipino Armed Forces. I grew up believing that communism would be an ideal government for our country. My parents were members of the militant group and were the ones who encouraged me to join. My toys were guns and bullets. I attended the country's best university where I studied political science, but my parents told me never to reveal my true identity. I graduated magna cum laude, and then I returned to the mountains where I engaged in many battles with the government forces. But life often makes some twists to surprise you. In one of our operations, I got caught by the soldiers and was taken to headquarters. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. One of the soldiers is a general. He interrogated me but never tortured me. He started to visit me and brought me food. I told him it was his way to get information from me, but he replied he really wanted to visit me. On one occasion, he brought me flowers. Gradually, my heart softened for the very first time. After 3 years in the prison, I was able to enter the government program. The rebels are given the chance to be free again on the condition they will never go back to their old life. I grabbed the opportunity. When I got out, the jailer and I were married. I sent my parents a letter, told them everything, they never replied. My husband and I decided to live in Japan because we knew the rebels would always find us if we remained in the Philippines. We lived in Japan for 32 years and had 3 children. In December of 13, we decided to return to the Philippines, but now using different names. We live on one of the beautiful islands in the country where we see the sun rising when we wake up. Life has been good for our family, and this is for spiritual objects, spiritual activities, and spiritual experiences. Now, just to show the other side of the story, and I don't have time to go into great detail in this, but I have here another spiritual transformative experience where a family was minding its own business, and what should happen, but government troops came in and accused the father and the mother of being rebels and killed them all. The one, and raped the daughter and killed her. The one surviving son, who was managed to hide, renounced Christianity, dropped out of the church, became a Muslim, and went off to the mountains, and he's fighting to this day as a rebel. And that was his spiritual transformative experience. So, you see, there can be both sides of an issue, a spiritual issue or a religious issue, both being a transformative experience. And as I say, this is one of the paradoxes we need to deal with in our field. So here's the conclusion. Transpersonal transformative experiences cannot be completely reported in their richness and fullness. And as I said before, no, we are not able to take the ineffable and make it completely effable. But we need to study this because it has practical implications for people's lives. And that's what science is all about. That's what transpersonal psychology is all about. Understanding human life, making people happier, fuller, more conscious, more aware, more loving. But they can be identified when they occur using the definitions and or instrument described in this presentation. Many other instruments exist in addition. Once identified, they can be studied by means of phenomenology, grounded theory, ethno-autobiography, multiple case studies, and other methods. The Castro scale can be used not only for identification purposes, but to assist in completing a report that inadvertently left out such items as spiritual setting and spiritual emotions. TTEs can play a vital role in counseling, psychotherapy, and self-help. Whether they last a few minutes or extend over several years, whether they're experienced by one person or a group of people, whether they are spiritual or secular, their recognition and awareness of their importance can be a major contribution of transpersonal psychology. For example, the question of ethics and morality needs to be raised when one experiences a TTE. As we have seen, some TTEs are life-affirming while others are life-denying. And understanding of the phenomenology of terrorism is a key issue that transpersonal psychology is well equipped to explore. And understanding of the ecological crisis also falls within the domain of transpersonal psychology. Therefore, transpersonal psychology can do more to alleviate suffering today than at any other time in its history. Thank you.